Hello, today we will be talking about zoogeography. To start with, what is zoogeography? Well, it's basically figuring out where animals are located, the branch of zoology that deals with the geographic distribution of animals. The map is more designed for terrestrial animals, but some of our fish are terrestrial in terms of that their location is determined by a land mass, right? They're the freshwater fishes. And then we have others that are marine, but you can kind of get an idea for the general areas we talk about. So we have like the Palearctic here, which is our light green kind of northern areas, the Nearctic here in blue where we are, the Neotropical for Southern America, the African, the Oriental, and the Australian kind of general regions. And basically what we want to know is, why do we find fish where we find fish? We're trying to answer some general questions. Why are some fish found in certain areas but not others? Why do you learn one set of fish if you take ichthyology here in Virginia, but if you took ichthyology in California, it would be a totally different set of fish? Why do some fish have a large home range and others are small? Some fish that you learn about here in Virginia, you would also learn in an ichthyology class if you took one maybe in Spain or Africa, because they would also be fish that are found over that big of an area. Other fish you're not going to see outside of a small area. Why? What determines where the fish are found? And that's pretty much what we want to know. What determines where fish are? Isn't the ocean connected? Doesn't the water go into the next? We have different names for them, but it's not like there's a wall that says you are now leaving the Atlantic Ocean. They're connected, so why aren't the fish connected? And that's what we're going to look at through a series of lectures here. Basically, our zoogeography topic will cover three major parts. Today we'll look at the factors influencing distributions, and that's mainly going to be looking at plate tectonics and continental drift. And then we're going to come back and look specifically at freshwater zoogeography and marine zoogeography and look at how the fish are distributed and try to kind of get at an idea of maybe why they're located where we find them. So this is one of the things we have to deal with, right? That the ocean is not really as connected as we think it is. When we look at it from our point of view, it's all water. Fish swim, can't they swim from one place to another? But it's not as easy once you look under the water. So this is a map of the ocean floor, and the first thing you notice is it's not all smooth. There are lots of things going on here. We have ridges that go up, we have valleys that go down. There's all sorts of topography down here that fish would have to interact with in order to move from one place to another. And the other thing to bear in mind is the features that we see on this map are not stable. They are changing, especially if we think of things from a geologic standpoint, which is on a very different time scale than what we're used to thinking about. So when we look at factors influencing distribution, that geologic timescale, that geologic history is one of the first things we have to think about. We're dealing with a very long timescale here, right? If you look at it from a point of view of where the continents were and what our oceans look like, it's this idea of plate tectonics, right? This idea that what we have has been changing, and that if you looked at the world 225 million years ago, the continents would have been all coalesced into one big group, Pangea. And you can see our general continents outlined in there, right? But it's basically one land mass. And then over time, 150 million years ago, they started to spread apart. We have Laurasia and Gondwana down here with our southern continents. And you start to see a change, right? Just look at the amount of coastline that's available. When the continents are all smushed up together, there's not a lot of coastline. But as we break apart, we start to get more coasts, more shallow water habitats for those fishes. Also, when they're all connected, that means that if there's rivers connecting those big continental land masses, those freshwater fishes can be distributed across multiple continents. But once we start to separate, right, you go to 100 million years ago, those fish in North America and Europe are not going to be able to make it to Africa on this map, right? Australia is out here by itself, as is India. By today, now we have those connections, right? South America is connected to North America. Africa and Asia and Europe share a connection. Australia, you're still out by yourself. And that's why we see the fish we do in certain places, or at least it's part of the explanation. And it's that idea of plate tectonics, right? The idea that our continental land masses are on these giant plates that are slowly moving around. How slowly? I've heard a couple different numbers. I've heard that over your lifetime, it's going to grow about the height of a person, so maybe like 175, 180 centimeters. I've also heard that they move about the rate of your fingernails growing. Maybe those end up being about the same, but it does show you that yes, there is movement, measurable movement year to year, but not really enough to where we're going to see a huge environmental change over our little short lifespan in relation to the geologic timescale. But the idea is these plates are moving, and they've moved into their current positions, and they're still moving today. How are they moving? Well, we'll do just a little bit of geology to look at this. It won't be too confusing. There's basically two things I want to show you on here. And you can think of this as being like under the ocean, right? And these, it's not necessarily going to be this close together, but we tried to show a lot of stuff in one picture here. So we have these ridges forming, right? And then we have these valleys, these trenches forming. And those are the two main features we want to look at. So to start with, we will look here at, there we go, this ridge that's forming here. And what we see when we look at it, because the arrows are showing us, is that the plates are being pulled apart, right? This is the way the movement is. We've got our different layers, right? We've got our crust and then the basalt layer under that, the lithosphere, and then down here, the asthenosphere. This is the magma, right? Think the stuff that comes out of volcanoes, right? This is our ocean. And over here is our continental landmass, right? Landmass, continental material, continental crust, okay? We all know where we are now. So back over here to my blue circle, the two plates are moving apart. You can see the basalt line is moving this way and this basalt line is moving that way at the rate that your fingernails grow. So it's not like they're just pouring out of the ground. They're moving very, very slowly. They're being pulled apart with their movement. As they're being pulled apart, something has to come up to fill in there, and that's coming up here from the asthenosphere. The new crust is formed by the material below rising up through that fault, okay? So that's what we call uplift. Okay, so uplift is the first thing where the plates are being pulled apart, the magma is coming up. This is creating that ridge on the ground, right, on the seafloor. The other thing we want to look at here is it's going to be over here in this zone of subduction, right, where we're making a trench. And to do that, we have to look at different parts. So we have our oceanic crust. It's being subducted down, right? We have a continental crust on top, so we're moving kind of under it, but we're pulling it along a bit. And that creates this zone of subduction or faulting. So we've got they're both being pulled down here, being cycled back in, right? And then over time, that's going to get cycled back up. These are not actually that close, and it's not moving that fast, but you get the general idea. And what we see is that where this is happening, if we go to the associated continental landmass, so not right over the trench, not right where the zone of subduction is, but nearby, we often see an arc of volcanoes forming, and that's over the landmass. So this is associated with this geologic movement. Okay, and this is what's called subduction. So we have two major things happening here, right? We have uplift, where the plates are being pulled apart, the magma's coming up. We have subduction, where it's moving down. That downward subduction is often associated with volcanoes over the nearby landmass. All right, getting an idea of how our plates are interacting with each other where they touch, when we get that movement, right? In some cases, they're going to be pulled apart, and other places they're going to be pushed together. So we're going to see uplift and subduction in various parts. All right. We do see how this influences distribution. We've got about 13 tectonic plates out here, right? Each in a different color. Some of them are really big, and some of them are smaller. But they're all moving, and you got arrows that kind of help show you how they move. There's a few things here we want to highlight. We'll look here at Iceland. Iceland has got those two plates being pulled apart. We see lots of tectonic activity here. We got lots of volcanoes associated with Iceland because of this movement. Now, if you go where we are here on the east coast of North America, not really much happening. We're not near major faults. There are smaller fault lines on each of the tectonic plates, so we do occasionally get movement. 7 or 8 years ago, we had a fairly decent earthquake here, but really they're quite rare, as opposed to somewhere like the West Coast, right, where we've got basically the plates are chasing each other here, and we see lots of movement. And again, there's smaller fault lines associated with this, so we tend to see lots of earthquakes on the West Coast of North America. A few other things to point out, we take the Indian plate here, right? So it's kind of on the Indian Australian plate. As India moved into Asia collided with the Eurasian plate. They're moving in opposite directions, and that's how we created the Himalayas, right? India joined up and hit it, and then they came up to make those tall mountains. So that's kind of an extreme uplift example. We also have here, we have the Philippine plate and the Pacific plate, and this is the deepest part of the ocean. This is the Marianas Trench. The Philippine and Pacific plates are colliding at unequal speeds, and this is making that really deep trench there. And we'll look at how that changes distribution when we start looking at the marine distributions. So we have to go back to this again, right? Those ridges, those valleys, all of that, that's created by those moving plates. Makes sense now, right? Now that we've actually talked about what's going on in the background, right? The plates are pulling apart from each other. They're pushing down. We're seeing those ridges. We're seeing those trenches. And we see this creating all of these different conditions. And this means that to go over a ridge, perhaps the temperature on one side is very different from the temperature on the other side, or the oxygen levels are different. So it may create a geographic barrier, and it may create an environmental barrier to limit that distribution, or at least influence the distribution. We have other things as well associated with those plates. You can kind of picture where those plates were. We get these hot spots. These are all volcanic activity, our earthquakes, things that show movement and changes happening. This may also have an influence on where the fishes are found, because it's going to limit your movement between different areas. So I tell you about continental drift, and we pretty much accept it these days, but do we have any real proof of it? Well, way back in 1596, it was first hypothesized by Abraham Ortelius. He saw it looked like jigsaw puzzle, right? If you took the Atlantic, you take South America and you take Africa, and even school kids will tell you they look like they should fit together. And it wasn't really until Alfred Wegener came along in 1912 that people looked at it kind of seriously. And he looked at it and said, well, we've got matching rocks here and here that look like they would fit up perfectly. And we've got fossils of an extinct reptile, the Mesosaurus, that are found on part of South America and part of Africa. And if we link them up together, right, then we can put that little guy right in there. They match up, the rocks match up. And then there's other rocks, folded sedimentary rocks here on Africa and North America, as well as Northern Europe and Asia and Greenland that match up as well. So it appears that it makes sense, right? Everything kind of fit together in a geological standpoint. And we see this again, we'll go back to these maps just to kind of drive the point home, but we'll also point out a few different things this time. So we have our continents, they're all shoved together, and there's not like a river in here, right? This is just a trace, a line to kind of show you where they should be. But look at the different oceans now and think about it if you're a fish and how your habitat is changing, not for you, but for your species over millions of years. Different habitats are available. It's going to change the different fish. We're going to see that diversification. So we've got kind of a little northern Arctic type ocean here, right? We've got this huge, big open ocean, and we have what's the Tethys Sea here in the middle. This might be some of your more shallow coastal areas in here. And as we move from 190 years to 150 million years, we see things start to change. We get the ocean starting in here as just a little ocean. What is found in there? What populated that first? We've got the Tethys Sea with its nice big coastline there, and we're starting to get the rifts forming that's going to break apart our different continents. At this point, we're connected, right? So freshwater fish, if there's rivers connecting them, streams connecting, they could be having a very wide distribution across these land masses. As we move to 95 million years ago, we start to see the continents making a bit more sense to us, right? They don't, not quite where they belong, but we can find them in there. And we can see we've got an Arctic Ocean starting. We've got a lot more coastlines suddenly available, though, a lot more potential habitat types. We also have isolated fragments, right? South America is not touching North America. They're not sharing freshwater fishes now. India is not sharing with anybody. He's all by himself. Australia is still connected with Antarctica, so there's still some connection there. And Africa is connected to Asia. As we move to 45 million years ago, Now Australia is all by itself. It's not sharing those freshwater fishes. India is by itself. Africa, South America. So everything's got a chance to kind of diversify from a freshwater standpoint by itself. But also we've got a lot more coastline available, a lot more potential habitat for those marine fishes. And while we're looking at this, I just have to throw this slide in because I think it's a very interesting picture. So if we take what we know on continental movements and we project this into the future, 250 million years down the road, this is what they say the planet will look like. So basically it's the same pattern, right? We coalesce, the continental land masses coalesce as Pangea, and then they fragmented up until how we know them today. And we're in the process of another coalescence. So in 250 million years, it's going to happen and the continents are all coming together. And you can still see we kind of have our North America, South America, and we've joined up with Africa and moving over into Eurasia. And there's some mountains there that might limit some movement, but depending on how the streams go, right, our fishes could change dramatically. Australia, it's still off by itself with Antarctica. The continents have moved, the waters, the oceans of the world are going to flow differently, so this may not be as cold as it is now, right? If the oceans can move and there's no landmass blocking it, it may not have the same cold Arctic, Antarctic conditions we're familiar with. But what's intriguing to me is this right here, this landlocked ocean and what it could possibly have in it, what was kept in it when it finally closed, what has evolved in it since it's been closed up. That to me is just an intriguing piece of the puzzle. It'd be interesting to figure out what would be in there. All right, back to what we're doing. We're going to recap the different bits and pieces we've been talking about here just to make sure we're all on the same page. So we have Pangea. Pangea is what we call it when it's all connected together. It's one big landmass. Pangea then splits up into two parts, right? We have Laurasia here, which are our northern continents, North America, Europe, and Asia in here. And then we have Gondwana, which are the southern continents. This is South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, Australia are all down in here. We also have the Panthalacia. So this is that big open ocean that's here, right? And this goes around. So it's not, there's no land masses in the middle. They're all on one side. So our ocean currents are going to be very different, right? We didn't get our Gulf Stream until North America and South America touched, and that stopped the oceans from going all the way around, right? So it's very different ocean patterns up here as well. And then another big one here is the Tethys Sea. So the Tethys Sea is kind of interesting because it starts off closed and then it opens. We'll look at this in a couple more slides. And they see some diversification that they link. Butterfly fish are one of the big examples where they see a diversification of them in that what's to become the Mediterranean, probably originating in the Tethys Sea. And then, of course, we move to our positions today where North and South America are connected and Africa's connected, and not Australia, though. We have to talk a bit about some terminology to how we describe what's going on. We have the vicariance biogeography. Basically, all that is that there's a geographical separation of a population. So something comes in and separates the population. It's typically some kind of physical barrier, and it results in a pair of closely related species. So it's some kind of barrier to dispersal. So it could be like a physical barrier that comes in, like there's a river, a pond, and it gets blocked in half, and now you've got closely related species on either side of it. We see this when North America and South America touch. Finally, we get species on either side that are very closely related. But we also have it in more of a long term. Think of the lungfish example we talked about. Right, closely related species, we've got the South American species and we've got the African species, but now they're geographically separated. The physical barrier this time was the ocean between them, right? They're freshwater fishes, so they couldn't disperse across. So we ended up with two closely related species, but that there are obviously distinct species as well. We can see this with the Tethys Sea as well, where the Tethys Sea allowed for kind of this radiation to happen. It removed a barrier and created a whole bunch of different fishes. This big diversification event we see, remember we talked about the Neoterigeans here, and this is from them back in the Permian moving up to modern day. And the width of this area tells you how many species we have, and we have lots of fish, as we know. We've been talking about the ray-finned bony fishes. This diversification is linked to the timing of the Tethys Sea opening. So here it's closed, right? The fish are stuck here. They can't get over into this area. But once it opens, fish can move, and then it opens more and more fish can move. And we see this movement of fish linked with this diversification of the actinopterygians. So they're able to move into this new habitat and exploit it. And what we'll see is that the fish that are here are going to have closely related relatives on the other side that evolve into different species by removing that barrier in this case. And we do have to mention Wallace's line. So this is kind of an interesting boundary line. It's a zoogeographic line, and it's basically for all of these species that are found here, these Asian species, it's the easternmost boundary for them. And it's the westernmost boundary for these Australian and New Guinea species. They are found to that line, but they don't go beyond it. The western sections here never had connection with the eastern sections. There was never a land connection there. There's a 35-kilometer separation of open ocean. So it keeps most of the land species out, right? I mean, you're not going to have, the kangaroos aren't going to be swimming across 35 kilometers of open ocean. And it even kept most of the bird species out. A few bats have crossed. And it's a deep water channel that stayed wet during the low water levels that we've had historically. So in the geologic time scale, ocean levels dropped, and a lot of these land masses actually were now connected by land bridges so that things could move back and forth. Didn't help fish too much because usually the bridges were narrow and you didn't necessarily have rivers moving between them, but other things could move back and forth. But the water channel stayed open even during the lowest water levels, and it seemed to be enough of a barrier to keep the fishes away as well. We'll bring this example back up when we'll talk about Wallace's line when we're looking at marine fish distributions. There's been some modifications. So this one here is Wallace's line. Weber came and said he thought this made a better line. Huxley liked this line better. But basically it's the same idea that in this area there's this distinct line that limits the distribution, and we see kind of western species and eastern species, but we don't see that intermixing of them. Some kind of barrier there that stopped the flow. And we do have some localized geologic events that happen. These could be linked to those vicariance dispersal that we talked about. You find a group of closely related species that share a common ancestral species and are endemic to an isolated locale, like a single lake or an island. So endemic means they're native, that's where they're found, that's the only place they're found. A good example to think about is Darwin's finches. There was a founding event where some finches made it to the island, and then they diversified, right? So that would be the ones that founded would be our common ancestral species. And then they diversified to fill all the available niches. So we see this with the Darwin's finches, we see this with honey creepers in Hawaii, we see this with some fishes too. What we end up with is a newly created habitat that has open niches. So it doesn't happen every time there's the right kind of geologic event. You have to have the right conditions as well. You have to have habitat that's usable with niches that are available. And you have to have pressures removed from the founding species. So again, go back to Darwin's finches, right? You've got finches that found this island, and there wasn't a big predator pressure on them. There wasn't any sort of shortage of food. So they had the flexibility and the ability to kind of diversify into those open niches. We see this with fishes. And when it happens, we get rapid speciation occurring. It's just this explosion of several descendant species from that original founding species. The best example of species flocks for fishes are the rift lakes in Africa and the cichlids. Cichlids are just amazing. We have 60 genera of cichlids, over 1,000 species. We can't even give it a number because they keep finding new species. Adaptive radiation, so these are the lakes here. And as they were separated, the cichlids just diversified into an amazing number of groups. A lot of this is due to how they eat. That protrusibility that they have and the pharyngeal teeth allowed this huge diversification to happen. And we see it, and just looking at their sizes, 4-centimeter species to 80-centimeter species. You can look at the pictures here, right? Look at how different all of those mouths are. Look at the difference in the fishes, but they're all cichlids. And the feeding differences, this differences in protrusibility in the pharyngeal teeth, mean we have specialists that feed just on phytoplankton, that feed just on sponges, that eat sediment. Ones that eat periphyton, so it's not just phytoplankton, they're going to be specific about the kind of plankton they eat. Ones that are leaf specialists, mollusks, ones that only eat benthic arthropods, or zooplankton. Some even specialize on fish scales and fins, some on fish eyes, some on eggs and embryos, and some are just predators of the other fishes. So the amazing thing is you have all of these fish that are specialists for certain kind of food. They are all cichlids, so they all came from the same founding stock, which is just amazing when you look at that much diversification when the conditions are right. There's lots of other fish flock examples out there. You can go to Lake Baikal in Russia. So we know this lake because it has that endemic freshwater monk seal, which is kind of unique. But it also has other flocks of things. It's got endemic amphipods, which are not as exciting to you because they're just a little invertebrate. But it means that there's lots of different species from a founding amphipod. What we see are catoid fishes. So this is a sculpin-like fish. And we now have 4 genera, 33 species, which is a lot from a founding species. The ancestors were benthic egg-laying fish, and now they've diversified to include live-bearing pelagic. So went from laying eggs, living on the bottom, to being pelagic, swimming around and having live birth. That's a lot of diversification. Lake Lanao in the Philippines, the cyprinid fishes, we have 3 genera and 18 species. And the cool thing about these guys is when they look at their jaws, the jaw characteristics are totally different from the normal characteristics that we see in cyprinid fishes. The unfortunate part is the holotypes. So remember when you first describe a species, right? You take a sample, a specimen, and that's the one you use for the description. And that specimen gets placed in a museum. That's the holotype, so that if anyone questions what it looked like, they can go back to that holotype and look at it. Those holotypes were destroyed during World War II. So we don't have the original samples. And now there's been introduced species, ones that are better for fishing, and they've replaced the natives, and we only have 3 species remaining. So we're losing that diversity already. Your book has lots more examples of fish flocks if you think they're interesting and you want to read a few more examples. It's kind of amazing when you think about the diversification that has happened. Climate change. We can't talk about factors influencing distributions without talking about climate change. And I don't mean the climate change that we're talking about right now on the news. It's not rapid short term. This is, again, the geological timescale. So we're talking long-term climate change. And we're talking about the last ice age, the Pleistocene glaciation, 2.5 million years ago to 10,000 years ago. So 10,000 years ago, that's not very long from a geologic timescale. The glaciers came down, you can see here in the shaded regions. Glaciers will kill the freshwater fish, right? They're going to freeze the water. It's going to be ice. The fish are not going to be able to survive that. And it also lowers the sea levels. So our current sea levels would have been 150 to 200 meters lower. So that's going to change your coastal habitat. If you are a fish that's associated with those coastal habitats, whether as an adult, as a juvenile, or as your larval stage, or if your food that you eat as a predator is associated with that, you're going to have some dramatic changes that you have to adapt to. And again, it's not like it just happened and suddenly everything was frozen. This happened over thousands, millions of years, so it was a gradual change. Many fish, many animals could adapt, some could not. But what it resulted in is isolation and allopatric speciation. So if you have one species and now it gets isolated into different areas and it's left there for enough time, it will actually develop into distinct species, right? They'll adapt to the local conditions and it'll change just enough that now once they're reunited and the water levels rise, they're no longer able to interbreed and you have 2 distinct species. So while we may think that it's going to kill off everything, it may actually increase diversity depending on how those isolated populations survive. And we do have other factors that influence distribution, right? They're not all just these grand, big things. Some are smaller, more personal from a fish's point of view. Abiotic factors, things like temperature. So fish have natural temperature and latitudinal limits, places that this is where they can live, and if it gets too cold or too warm, they're unable to be able to survive in those habitats. So they need to be in that right area, and that may keep them from moving. If you're a tropical fish found at the equator, you may not be able to move very far north or south before the temperatures are something that you cannot live at. And along with those abiotic factors are things like your oxygen levels, your salinity levels, right? So if you need a certain level of oxygen, if you're able to supplement it, then you're going to have different habitats. If you have a certain level of salt that you can handle, but also, as we'll see when we talk about marine fishes, marine distributions, freshwater rivers empty into the oceans, and a lot of fish distributions have to change in association with the river mouth because there your salinity level has changed. A certain fish can handle that, lower salinity where it's mixing with the fresh water, other fish cannot, and that restricts their distribution. Habitat is also something to think about. If you have specific requirements, if you need those rocky shores or you need that certain kind of substrate, then you're going to be limited to where you have that. And even if there's other patches of that habitat available, if you are unable to survive and survive the movement between patches, then you're going to be limited to where you are. And there's biotic factors too, ones that make sense, right? You cannot live where there's lots of predators or they will eat all of you. And you can also not live where you have no prey or you will die of starvation. So that will influence where your distribution is as well. You know, if there's lots of predators, you're going to go somewhere else. If you're going to be where your food is in order to survive. And we do have those life history limits as well. So if your life history has a larval period that needs a specific substrate, that's going to limit where you are. Many fish have the pelagic larvae that just kind of float around the surface and then settle, and that may settle into appropriate habitat or not appropriate habitat. And it also depends on your swimming ability. If you are not a good swimming species, like if you are a seahorse, even if there is good habitat, it's difficult for you to disperse any sort of distance. You don't have that ability to swim long distances. So that took us through our first part of zoogeography, looking at some of those factors that influence distribution. So this is giving you the background, right? We talked about plate tectonics, we talked about continental drift, to kind of set us up for an in-depth discussion of freshwater zoogeography and marine zoogeography. So as always, as you're reviewing this information, please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.